The ordinary morning of May 5th, 2009, a husband and father left the house to go to the gym. When he returned, his family was dead.
Christopher L. Coleman was born in 1977 in Chester, Illinois, a small river town where the Mississippi cut a wide path through the landscape and where everyone seemed to know each other's name. Chester was the kind of place where life was measured in high school football games, church services, and the steady hum of blue-collar work. Chris grew up in a religious household that instilled discipline, order, and a sense of respect for authority. From a young age, he was taught that faith and family were the twin pillars of life, the foundation upon which everything else was to be built. Chris wasn't the loudest or the most charismatic child, but he was athletic, disciplined, and driven. He grew tall and muscular, playing sports in high school and eventually joining the military after graduation. His time in the Marines honed his physique and demeanor further, the rigid schedules, the emphasis on physical strength and endurance, the camaraderie and discipline. He was the kind of man who carried himself with control, shoulders squared, jaw set, the type who made an impression when he walked into a room. It was during his years in uniform that Chris began to chart a course for his future. He wanted stability, respect, and a career that would elevate him beyond the small-town limits. He was ambitious, and that ambition would later steer him into the orbit of one of the largest evangelical ministries in America. But before that, he met Sherry. Sherry Weiss was everything Chris was not. Where he was reserved, she was vibrant. Where he seemed calculated, she was spontaneous. Born in 1977 as well, Sherry grew up in Columbia, Illinois, not far from where she would eventually meet her fate. She was known for her bright smile, her energy, her love of people. Friends remembered her as outgoing, artistic, the kind of woman who lit up a room when she walked in. She had a rebellious streak as a teenager, but beneath it was a heart of gold, a kindness that endeared her to anyone who knew her. Chris and Sherry met in the mid-1990s, introduced through mutual friends. Their courtship was swift. Chris, in his crisp Marine uniform, cut an impressive figure. Sherry, with her laughter and warmth, softened his stoic edges. Their differences seemed complementary, the disciplined soldier and the free-spirited young woman. To outsiders, they were a picture of balance. They married in 1997, and soon after, their life began to take shape. By the early 2000s, Chris had left the Marines and landed a position with Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the most prominent evangelical organizations in the country. Joyce Meyer, a charismatic televangelist whose broadcasts reached millions, needed someone she could trust for security. Chris, with his military background, his clean-cut image, and his quiet seriousness, fit the role perfectly. He became head of security, traveling with the ministry, ensuring Joyce Meyer's safety, and in doing so, elevating himself into a world of influence and privilege that few from his small-town roots could have imagined. The job paid well, affording Chris and Sherry a comfortable life. They purchased a spacious two-story house on a cul-de-sac in Columbia, Illinois, in a quiet subdivision where neighbors waved from driveways and children rode bikes under watchful eyes. Sherry embraced the role of homemaker, pouring her energy into raising their two sons, Garrett and Gavin. Born in 1999 and 2002, the boys were the center of her world. She decorated their rooms with care, volunteered at school events, and filled the house with warmth. Family photographs from those years show smiling faces, vacations, a portrait of a perfect suburban family. Yet perfection often masks fractures. Sherry, though devoted to her family, confided in friends that life with Chris was not as easy as it appeared. Chris's job demanded long hours and frequent travel, leaving her to manage the household alone much of the time. His personality, once appealing in its discipline, became rigid, controlling. Sherry wanted affection, spontaneity, the kind of emotional connection she had always given so freely. Chris seemed increasingly distant, focused on work, on fitness, on maintaining an image. Sherry turned to her creativity for solace. She loved painting, decorating, and spending time with friends. Her social energy was a contrast to Chris's growing isolation. Friends noticed the strain between them. Sherry sometimes hinted at unhappiness, though she always circled back to her devotion to her children. Leaving Chris was not something she considered lightly. She believed in family, in vows, in staying for the sake of the boys. Chris, meanwhile, was wrestling with desires and ambitions that clashed with the image he projected. In 2008, he began an affair with a woman named Tara Lentz, a childhood friend of Sherry's. Tara lived in Florida, and their relationship began as casual conversations before evolving into something more. For Chris, it was intoxicating. Tara was lively, adventurous, a reminder of freedom outside the constraints of marriage. Their phone records would later reveal constant communication, calls, texts, emails exchanged daily. To Tara, Chris promised a future. He told her he would leave Sherry, that they would build a life together once the time was right. But Chris's world was not one where divorce came easily. He worked for a Christian ministry that preached family values, fidelity, and faith. A divorce would not only stain his reputation, but likely cost him his lucrative job. His identity was wrapped in the image of devoted husband, father, and protector of a ministry empire. He lived in a contradiction, unwilling to let go of Tara, unwilling to risk the fallout of leaving Sherry. Sherry sensed the distance, though she may not have known the full truth. Friends later recalled her expressing sadness, uncertainty about Chris's commitment, a longing for the warmth that had faded from their marriage. Yet she carried on, pouring herself into her sons, keeping the household afloat, maintaining the image of normalcy that Chris so carefully cultivated. By 2008, cracks in the facade widened. Chris spent more time away, more time at the gym, more time on the phone. Sherry spent more time with friends, confiding that something felt off. They still appeared together at church events, at school functions, at family gatherings, smiling for photos, but beneath the smiles was tension, unspoken and unresolved. As winter gave way to spring in 2009, the Coleman family stood at a crossroads they could not yet see. Sherry continued to care for her boys, plan family outings, and dream of brighter days. Chris continued his affair with Tara, promising her a future he could not deliver without tearing apart his own. He was trapped between two worlds, and in that pressure, darkness began to brood. No one could have imagined that the man entrusted with protecting one of America's most famous preachers would soon orchestrate a crime so brutal, so cold, that it would shock the nation. The first signs of something ominous arriving figure, adored by millions, criticized by others who dismissed her as a prosperity preacher. But threats to her security team were rare. Chris brought the emails after still filled the walls of the Columbia, Illinois home. As the threats loomed, Chris's double life deepened. With Sherry at home and the ministry under the impression he was a devoted husband facing external dangers, Chris was on the phone with Tara Lentz almost constantly. Their conversations grew more passionate, their plans more concrete. Chris told her he loved her, that he was going to leave Sherry soon, that they would be together permanently. Tara believed him. She told friends she thought Chris was finally ready to break free, that they would soon start their life in Florida, but Chris was boxed in. Divorce would have been catastrophic for his career. Joyce Meyer Ministries promoted traditional family values, and Chris's salary and position depended on upholding that image. Leaving Sherry openly would mean losing not only his job, but his reputation. And yet, the pull of Tara, the promise of escape and a new life, was intoxicating. He could not let her go. To Sherry's friends later remembered how she confided about her troubled marriage. She hinted at Chris's distance, his obsession with the gym, his secretiveness with his phone. She suspected infidelity, though she might not have known the details. She longed for the warmth that had once defined their marriage. At the same time, she seemed resigned. Her focus was always on her boys, making sure they felt loved even as the ground beneath the family began to crack. The emails kept coming, strange and ominous, always targeting Chris's family as leverage against him. The Columbia police began documenting them, but there was little they could do without more leads. To neighbors, the Coleman home still looked picture-perfect, manicured. Lawn, toys scattered across the driveway, a family living the American dream. Inside, tension simmered. As the spring of 2009 approached, Chris's world grew darker. He spoke constantly to Tara, promising her that Sherry would be out of the picture soon. He told her they would vacation together, that they would live openly. Tara pressed him for timelines, and Chris assured her that everything would be resolved by May. For her, It was the promise of a future. For him, it was a deadline looming closer with each passing day. Sherry, meanwhile, told a friend she felt something terrible was coming. In a chilling conversation weeks before her death, she confided that if anything ever happened to her, Chris would be responsible. The words hung heavy, dismissed at the time as the venting of a troubled wife. But later they would become prophetic. On the evening of May 4th, 2009, the Coleman family went through the rhythms of an ordinary Monday. Sherry tucked Garrett, 11, and Gavin, 9, into bed. The boys laughed, chattered, oblivious to the storm about to break over their lives. Sherry, to his family, he gave little more than silence. At dawn on May 5th, Chris rose early. According to his account, he left the house at 5:30 a.m. to go to the gym. He was meticulous about his workouts, sculpting his body into the image of discipline he carried like armor. Neighbors saw him leaving, alone, in his SUV. The house behind him was quiet, the boys still asleep in their beds, Sherry beginning her day an hour later. Chris claimed he tried calling Sherry from the gym, but got no answer. He texted her, again with no reply. Concerned, he said, he drove back to the house around 6:45 a.m. What he found, he told police, was a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside the Coleman home, Sherry lay dead in her bed, strangled. Nearby, Garrett and Gavin were also found in their rooms, their young lives cut short by the same brutal method. The house heated that his work for Joyce Meyer had made him a target, that his family had paid the price for his role in protecting her. He presented himself as a man caught in the crosshairs of forces beyond his control. His grief appeared on the surface, but seasoned detectives watched closely. His tone, his composure, the way he answered questions, all of it was cataloged. Something about him seemed too measured. Investigators began digging deeper. They collected Chris's computer, traced the origin of the threatening emails. The trail led back not to a shadowy outsider, but to an IP address directly connected to Chris himself. The revelation was damning. The very emails that set up the narrative of external danger had been authored inside the Coleman home, on the same network Chris used daily. The supposed threats were not warnings from enemies of Joyce Meyer. They were fabrications planted by Chris as part of a cover. The question that loomed larger with each passing day was motive. Why would a man murder his wife and 2 young sons, strangling them in their sleep? The answer emerged quickly: Tara Lentz. Phone records showed hundreds of calls, thousands of texts between Chris and Tara in the weeks leading up to the murders. Their affair, passionate and all-consuming, revealed a man desperate to leave his marriage. But Chris was trapped. Divorce would destroy his reputation, his job, his carefully constructed image as Joyce Meyer's trusted protector. To Chris, there seemed only one solution: erase the family that tied him down. Investigators confronted Chris with the evidence. His denials grew thin. His explanations faltered. He could not explain why the threatening emails originated from his own computer. He could not justify the constant communication with Tara, the promises he had made to her about a new life by May. And he could not reconcile his image as a grieving husband with the cold facts that were stacking against him. Meanwhile, Sherry's friends came forward with haunting recollections. She had confided to one that if anything happened to her, Chris would be responsible. The memory chilled investigators, adding weight to their suspicions. Sherry had sensed something, had known on some instinctual level that her husband's distance carried a darker meaning. As the case built, Chris's behavior came under sharper scrutiny. At the funeral, his demeanor struck many as off, too controlled, too focused on appearances. He did not cry as others cried, did not collapse under the weight of loss the way most fathers would. He spoke of logistics, of next steps, of things that seemed strangely detached from the enormity of what had happened. The unraveling of Chris Coleman was swift. Detectives presented the affair, the emails, the financial motives, the inconsistencies. The narrative of a devoted husband targeted for his ministry work crumbled, replaced by the image of a man willing to strangle his family to preserve his own ambitions and satisfy his desires. The arrest came not with shock, but with grim inevitability. The community that had once admired Chris as a man of faith and discipline now saw him in a new light, a murderer hiding behind a facade. When he was charged, the town of Columbia gasped in collective horror. This was not the act of an outsider. not the vengeance of a ministry's critic. It was betrayal from within, the destruction of a family by the very man meant to protect it. Neighbors who had once waved at Chris from driveways now recoiled at the sight of his name. Sherry's family, already shattered by loss, faced the even more unbearable truth that the killer was the husband she had once trusted. The case, when brought before the public, stunned the nation. It was not just another domestic homicide. It was a story of a man who lived a double life so meticulously that he created fake threats to cover his own intent. It was the story of a woman who had sensed danger in her own home and of two boys whose futures were stolen before they began. And at the center of it all was Chris Coleman, a man who wore the mask of protector while plotting his predator. The courthouse in Waterloo, Illinois, became the stage for one of the most closely watched trials in the state's history. By the time Chris Coleman was indicted for the murders of his wife Sherry and their sons Garrett and Gavin, the case had already drawn national attention. The facts were lurid, the betrayal unspeakable, the crime so cold that even seasoned journalists struggled to find words to frame it. The story of the Coleman family had transformed from suburban portrait to nightmare, and now the justice system would sift through the horror to decide the fate of the man accused of orchestrating it in the months leading up to trial. Pre-trial hearings were dominated by arguments over evidence. The defense sought to exclude the threatening emails, claiming they were prejudicial, while the prosecution pressed to show how the digital trail led unmistakably to Chris. Phone records, internet searches, computer forensics, all pointed to a husband fabricating threats against himself as a smokescreen for the murders he was planning. The judge allowed the evidence, ruling it essential to the case. Sherry's family, devastated but resolute, attended every hearing. Her parents sat quietly, clutching tissues, their faces etched with grief and determination. They had lost their daughter and two grandsons in one violent sweep, and now they were forced to relive the horror in meticulous detail. For them, justice was not a word. It was survival. The trial opened in April 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders. The prosecution wasted no time painting Chris Coleman as a man living a double life, a man who wanted freedom from his wife and children but refused to sacrifice his career and image by filing for divorce. Instead, they argued, he chose to eliminate them. The jury was shown photographs of Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, their lives cut short in their own home. The images were harrowing, leaving the courtroom hushed. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the digital trail of the threatening emails. Forensic experts testified how the messages were traced directly back to Chris's computer using his own internet connection, typed on his own keyboard. The supposed threats from an outsider were, in fact, his own creation. It was a meticulous deception that unraveled under the scrutiny of technology. They presented phone records that revealed Chris's obsession with Tara Lentz. In the weeks leading up to the murders, the two exchanged thousands of texts and calls, often speaking for hours late at night. In those messages, Chris promised her a future together. He told her he loved her. He told her he would be free by May. The timing was damning. Sherry and the boys were killed on May 5. Witnesses were called to give voice to the victims. Sherry's friends testified about her growing unease, her suspicion that Chris was unfaithful, her chilling remark that if anything ever happened to her, her husband would be responsible. Her words echoed through the courtroom like a prophecy. Fulfilled. Neighbors described the Colemans as picture-perfect on the outside, but Sherry's confidences peeled back the facade. The prosecutor in their own beds, then staged a narrative of threats to deflect suspicion. He was not a grieving husband. He was a calculating murderer. The defense clung to the absence of direct eyewitnesses, urging the jury to consider reasonable doubt. When the jury retired to deliberate, tension filled the courtroom. Sherry's family sat in silence, holding hands, praying for justice. Hours stretched, each one heavy with the possibility of uncertainty. But when the jurors returned, their verdict was clear. Chris Coleman was guilty on all counts. 3 charges of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Sherry's family wept openly, some sobbing, others bowing their heads in prayer. The weight of justice did not erase their pain, but it offered something like resolution. Chris sat motionless, his face a mask, as the words were read. The man who had once walked proudly in his Marine uniform, who had guarded a televangelist, who had lived in a beautiful suburban home, was now condemned by his own choices to AT sentencing. The prosecution pressed for the harshest penalty, life, without parole. They argued that a man who could strangle his wife and children in cold blood should never again walk free. The judge agreed. Chris Coleman was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. For Sherry's family, the sentence was both a relief and a burden. They had justice, but no one could return Sherry's laughter, Garrett's energy, Gavin's innocence. For Columbia, the verdict marked the end of a chapter, but the trial may have ended with Chris Coleman sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms, but the shockwaves of the case continued to ripple through the lives of everyone connected to it. For Columbia, Illinois, the quiet suburban community where the murders took place, the case became an open wound, one that still pulsed with memory every time someone drove past the Coleman. Inside prison walls, Chris Coleman began his new life as inmate rather than protector. His once polished image, the Marine, the head of security, the devoted father he pretended to be if he divorced Sherry. The ministry had tried to uphold its values of family and faith, unaware of the darkness lurking inside the man tasked with protecting them. The irony was not lost on the public. The man who had sworn to guard others had become the killer within his own home. Unforgettable was not only the brutality of the crime, but the intimacy of it. Chris Coleman had not killed strangers or rivals. He had strangled his wife as she slept, silenced his sons in their beds. The hands that should have protected them had become the instruments of their deaths. It was a crime that stripped away any illusion of safety, leaving behind only grief, anger, and disbelief. Years later, Sherry's words still echoed. "If anything happens to me," she had told a friend, "it will be Chris." It was a warning, a plea, a glimpse into the fear she carried in her final days. That her prediction proved true made the crime all the more haunting. She had seen the storm on the horizon, and no one had been able to stop it. Today, Chris Coleman remains behind bars, a man serving out his days in the shadow of his own choices. Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin are remembered not for the way their lives ended, but for the joy they brought to those who loved them. Their photographs still circulate, their smiles frozen in time, reminders of innocence destroyed but not forgotten. The Coleman murders remain etched in America's true crime history, a story of betrayal, ambition, and cold calculation that shattered a family and stunned a nation. It endures as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats come not from strangers, but from within the very walls meant to keep us safe.